The Ukraine war has been going on for roughly 11 months now, and I haven't made any comments basically because, well, there's a lot of people making comments about it, and my interest is actually more general in the study of wars, so I actually figured I'd look into it in detail once it was over. Obviously, I was one of the people who expected it to be a quick Russian victory, which, well, that didn't happen. But anyway, um, a lot of comparisons have been made, and I've really had to bite my tongue to not comment on some of them. Um, so, what I'm going to try to do today is just comment on a few of the major ones that seem to come up over and over. Um, and I'm not sure why. So let's get to that. Let's start with the Forever Wars, which is a critical reference to the wars that were fought in Afghanistan and in Iraq. Now, in the early days of the war in Ukraine, that comparison actually probably had some validity to it. Certainly, if you expected the war to go quickly, so there would be a brief conventional period, and then there'd be a long drawn out insurgency, Ukrainian insurgency. If you were expecting something like that to happen, then yeah, the Forever Wars made sense. But since the war has continued as a conventional war for 11 months now, and it is certain to continue to be a conventional war for quite a bit longer, I there's no basis for the comparison anymore. And I think nowadays the only reason that these wars keep getting brought up is that there was huge financial expenditures, a lot of time, and ultimate failure. And I think that's the key ones to. So you're just throwing money after something that is ultimately going to fail. And I think that's where everybody was, who still references the Forever Wars and that the Ukraine is just another Forever War. That's basically where they're coming from. This is going to be a failure. So you find out more on the focus on the places where people are against continuing to support Ukraine. Another war that just boggles my mind, but comes up regularly, is the Winter War fought between Finland and the Soviet Union back in 1939 and early 1940. Generally, that war comes up and is referred to as because, well, how do I put this? Because the Soviet Union did really poorly when it invaded Finland. There's no question they got a bloody nose in the first month. And it tends to be the case that people who refer to this war use it as a touchstone, I guess, is a way to describe it, of, well, the Russians always do poorly at the beginning of the war, but they get their act together and ultimately win. And I mean, that's kind of interesting, but wrong. I think one of the critical differences, fun fact, when the Soviet Union invaded Finland, World War II was already going on. France and Britain were at war with Germany. And oddly enough, although not in cooperation, the Germans and the Anglo-French allies considered sending weapons and manpower to fight with the Finnish. Now, neither one did that, and there was a lot of political considerations there, because effectively, for the British and the French, that would mean that, that they'd end up at war with the Soviet Union as well as Germany. So they hesitated. And for the Germans, who were already at war with France and Great Britain, well, that would create the two-front war that they worked so hard to avoid with the Molotov-Ribbentrop treaty in 1939. So ultimately, Finland fought on its own and was overwhelmed and ultimately made peace on Soviet terms. But there's very little there to argue is comparable to what's happening in Ukraine. Ukraine, after all, isn't fighting alone. It is the only state with troops, but it's certainly got massive material support and financial support from basically all of NATO, at least, and some other Western allies. So that's a really poor comparison as well. And then, of course, there's World War I. Now, oddly enough, I can see a lot of basis for comparison with World War I. But it generally just boils down to, well, there's a lot of artillery and there's trenches, as if there's been no other wars in which artillery and trenches have been major factors in a war. I mean, trenches showed up in the the American Civil War, I believe, this first time the troops started digging in order to avoid being killed. It's just stunning. Now, there are interesting aspects to World War I. It's actually instructive to note that World War I is a war in which Russia, or the Russian Empire, surprised everyone by launching a major offensive in 1914, much quicker than the German Empire anticipated it could. And they nearly broke through the German defense lines in the east, while the Germans were busy attacking in the west. So there's a counterexample where Russia actually did do well at the beginning and then had a very gradual and devastating decline due to being overwhelmed by the Germans and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So again, not really a very sound example on that basis, but also there are some lessons from World War I. New technology was introduced. Today in Ukraine, drones are apparently critically important in a reconnaissance role. Well, oddly enough, in 1914, new to warfare at that time was the introduction of airplanes for reconnaissance, which again had a critical impact on the outcome. So there are interesting things that if you consult with historians, you might actually learn something about what to expect in terms of the evolution of technology and the impact of technology from World War One. But that doesn't seem to be what everyone is doing. Instead, they're basically focused on trenches and artillery. Folks, there's very few wars in which trenches and artillery haven't been deployed since World War One. It's actually really hard to imagine a war in which those wouldn't be used, especially if the front is relatively stable, as it is from time to time in any war. Once some stability is achieved, defensive positions are built. And given time, those defensive positions are expanded and connected, and there you have trenches. But anyway, that's a couple of comments I just thought I'd raise, and I'm going to try and do another commentary that addresses the Ukrainian war that compares the Ukrainian war with some wars that haven't actually been considered, but I think have some instructive value. So anyway, that's about it for today. Thanks for listening, and if you have comments, please leave them. Thank you.